Hey everybody, it is Wednesday, April 16th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Mo Shwanunu. This is the place, of course, where we bring you just the facts and we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. As you probably can tell by now, Jill is off today. She's off for the rest of the week on a well-deserved vacation. Before we get to the headlines, I want to tell you that the show that I said I was watching last weekend, we have finished the first couple episodes of Friends and Neighbors on Apple with John Hamm. I'm going to say I highly recommend this show. It's the return of John Hamm, his first lead role since he was Don Draper on Mad Men. The show, well written, well acted, over on Apple TV. So definitely check out Friends and Neighbors. We also got into Paradise over on Hulu, which is sort of a mystery involving the president in a future scenario. That also is interesting, though. Again, I give my full recommendation for Friends and Neighbors over on Apple. So you're getting a little midweek what I'm watching here. Let me know what you guys think. The third episode of that Apple series comes out on Friday. All right, let's get to today's headlines. A lot to get to today as we are officially now in the middle of the week. By the end of this workday, we'll be closer to the weekend than last weekend. Congratulations. All right, the headlines here. A federal judge yesterday pressing the Trump administration over its refusal to return that migrant it accidentally deported to El Salvador, what the judge is saying now and what the White House maintains. Meanwhile, we'll get into the Trump administration plan to cut funding for NPR and PBS. They call the fact those networks get federal funding a grift, what they're telling Congress to do about it. And he's back, sort of. Former President Biden goes after Trump in his first public post-presidency speech, what he's saying and how the White House is replying. Human teeth grown in a lab for the first time. We'll tell you about this study coming out of England. This could lead to a major breakthrough in the future for anyone who's ever lost a tooth. All right, some airline news. We'll tell you about the final major airline that is adding free Wi-Fi after all their other competitors rolled out free Wi-Fi. A new trend in bizarre animal trafficking out of Africa. This one will surprise you. And what the producer of Home Alone 2 is saying about that part where Donald Trump appears in the film, what he says he would like to do now, more than 30 years later. And finally, on this day in history, a bit of Rolling Stones history, as well as how the term Cold War first got started. All right, let's get started here with the latest in the immigration deportation story, that case we've been closely following of the migrant mistakenly deported to El Salvador. A federal judge saying yesterday that she will now order sworn testimony by Trump administration officials to determine whether the Justice Department and Trump officials have been following her orders to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. It's been several weeks now since he was deported and since the government admitted that they were not supposed to deport him, and yet he remains in prison in El Salvador. A U.S. District Judge Sheeney's yesterday in Maryland saying that she first heard the case weeks ago. She's frustrated by what she views as no progress by the Trump administration in returning him. She is calling for the administration to return him, especially since they admit they were not supposed to deport him. They call it a clerical error, an administrative error, but they say they have no intention of bringing him back to the U.S. Now, a little background here. Despite him coming in illegally back in 2011, a judge granted Abrego Garcia legal status here in 2019, saying he specifically cannot be deported back to El Salvador. He faced threats on his life there. They did say he could be deported to another place, but she granted him legal status to work here. He has since married an American, has several children here, but he was picked up last month. Again, the government saying they had bad paperwork and deported with 200 others to that prison in El Salvador without going through a judge. No due process before that. Now, the government has again said it was a mistake, but they don't believe they have to return him. In fact, they say they have complied with all the judge's orders. The judge saying, no, I've told you to facilitate. And the first term she used was effectuate his release. She is now saying, I'm calling on you to facilitate and direct his release. The government's saying they can't do that. They cannot tell El Salvador what to do, even if they're paying El Salvador to hold these prisoners in their country. The Supreme Court, to a certain extent, backed up the district judge last week, hearing the case. The decision 9-0, saying, yes, the administration does need to, quote, facilitate his release, but they took issue with that other word, effectuate, asking for clarification. So Sheeney's, the judge late last week, said, okay, Supreme Court, I won't use the word effectuate, I will use the word direct. I want the government to facilitate and direct his release. Now, the government is using a lot of this back and forth over terminology as one of the reasons they're delaying here. Again, they say they're following court orders, but as far as they're concerned, all the Supreme Court said was facilitate his release And the way they interpret facilitate is to allow him in or provide a plane if El Salvador deports him. But El Salvador has said, we have no plans to deport him. Now, lost in translation here, the U.S. hasn't asked El Salvador to deport him, and the U.S. again says, we're not going to ask them. So he remains in prison there despite the mistake. The judge saying, you guys are being effectively cute with language here. The delay tactics must stop. As far as I'm concerned, as far as most of us are concerned, facilitate means bring the guy home. So she issued an order last night calling for an investigation into what the government has and has not actually been doing to return the man. The Trump officials continue to refuse to retrieve him, and she believes they are defying the Supreme Court. Again, the White House saying that's not how we interpret facilitate. Well, this frustrated the judge. She's conducting a full investigation, expect depositions here over the next couple of weeks. She says the Supreme Court has spoken and the government remains obligated to take the steps available to them towards aiding, assisting, and making easier his release back to the U.S. Now, Abrego Garcia's lawyers are super frustrated here. They say the government should be held in contempt, that the government has not done enough, especially since they admit he legally was not supposed to be sent back to El Salvador. The White House saying, again, our bad, effectively, but ultimately we are under no obligation to bring him back. They stand by the fact that back in 2019, a judge said that they could deport him to another country and effectively accepted the government's argument at that time that he was a member of the gang MS-13, though the only evidence they had was a confidential informant to a cop who's turned out to be unreliable since then. And he was wearing Chicago Bulls paraphernalia, which they took to mean his membership there in MS-13. Apparently wearing Bulls paraphernalia means you're in MS-13. So he was never convicted of being part of MS-13. There's no evidence besides the anonymous informant, who, by the way, placed him in a wrong state. But nonetheless, the administration saying, nope, as far as we're concerned, that immigration judge 6 years ago found him to be part of a gang. He has, though, since he crossed the border illegally back 14 years ago, never committed a crime while he was here in the U.S., and that's something that his side likes to reinforce. I did mention he does have a wife here. They have a 5-year-old together. He also is the father of 2 stepchildren. His wife was in court yesterday. Take a listen to what Jennifer Vasquez Sura said outside the courthouse.
I will not stop fighting until I see my husband alive. Kilmar, if you can hear me, stay strong. God hasn't forgotten about you. Our children are asking, when would you come home? And I pray for the day I tell them the time and date that you'll return.
Now, this hearing yesterday came one day after we told you about that meeting between the Salvadoran president and Donald Trump, both of them saying they had no intention of bringing him back here. The Salvadoran president going so far as to call him a terrorist, saying, why would I smuggle a terrorist inside the U.S.? Again, the U.S. hasn't officially asked him to return him. Nonetheless, you get a pretty clear sense that the two of them are very happy to keep him behind bars in El Salvador. You're going to have a Democratic senator today, Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. Abrego Garcia was from Maryland. Van Hollen of Maryland will be traveling to El Salvador today. He says he's going to be checking on Abrego Garcia's well-being, ensuring that he is safe and alive and well in prison. As far as Van Hollen is concerned, he also views the term facilitate to mean that the government should be bringing him back, should be requesting him back and bringing him back to the U.S. He says he's lived here for 14 years. He got a job in construction. He got married. He's raising 3 children with disabilities. And again, even the government admits they weren't supposed to send him there. And there's a lot of folks, including some Republicans, who don't like what precedent this could set, that the government can admit they made a mistake by deporting the wrong person and then not have to do anything about it. And so there's a lot of truths here. And this is something I explained on the Instagram page yesterday. On the right, you will hear that he came here illegally. He was accused of being a part of MS-13, and an immigration judge deferred to the government on that assertion at that time. He was among 200 men, some of them notorious criminals who were sent to this prison in El Salvador, and the government can't do anything about getting him back. On the left, you will hear that he was married to an American. He committed no crimes while he was here. He was given legal status by a judge to work here. That judge put out an order that he was not allowed to be deported to El Salvador due to threats on his life. He was a union worker. He was taking care of 3 kids with disabilities. He was inappropriately deported, something the government admits, and he was sent to a prison that the U.S. is paying $20,000 per person to El Salvador to hold. And I will tell you that all those facts from the right and the left all are true. You can hold them all truth together because depending on what media outlet you listen to or watch or read, you might get some of those facts, or they could be emphasizing some of those facts. So I just wanted to present all of that to all of you today, especially that continued confusion about whether he was in a gang or wasn't a gang, etc., to lay out the confusion there, including the confidential informant. Apparently, the confidential informant told a cop back then. That cop turned out to be suspended for activities like lying and giving information to people he shouldn't have. So there's a lot of complicated information there. When it comes to the various allegations you might be hearing from both sides. This is a case we're going to continue to watch here, and will likely go up through the system again. It's now started at a district court, went to the Supreme Court, it's now back at a district court, and it could go back to the Supreme Court again, but it is one of the most watched cases right now when it comes to all things immigration and deportation. All right, we have a lot of stories to get to in this special solo edition of the Mo News podcast. Thanks for joining me. First, a couple quick ads for you, and then I'll be back with a speed read. All right, now let's get to today's speed read. This from the Associated Press. The White House is planning to ask Congress to claw back more than $1 billion slated for public broadcasting in the coming weeks. That could mean cutting almost all federal support for NPR and PBS, among other outlets. The plan is expected again in late April. The Trump administration asking Congress to rescind $1.1 billion in federal funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That is the taxpayer-supported nonprofit that funds public media organizations. It's been around for decades. Now, if they want to rescind this funding, which a lot of it goes to NPR and PBS, the vote will require a simple majority in the House and Senate. With Republicans controlling both chambers, it could pass, though we should note that there are a few Republicans in each chamber who are supporters of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, NPR and PBS, so it's something we will definitely watch. A little history here for all of you. President Lyndon Johnson first created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting back in the 1960s. There was criticism at the time that all the airwaves, radio and TV at the time, were controlled by companies looking to make a profit, running commercial stations. There was not enough educational programming for Americans. So at the time, the government creates the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to help distribute funds for educational programming. Now, this has always been an issue for Republicans. Nearly every Republican presidential candidate and president, except for Gerald Ford back then in the mid-70s, but every other Republican president has tried to cut funding or talked about cutting funding to NPR and PBS. One of their frustrations over the past 50 years is they feel their programming, especially their news programming, leans progressive and liberal. Here's a short bite of Mitt Romney actually talking about this back in his 2012 presidential run in a debate with Barack Obama at the time.
I'm sorry, Jim. I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS. I'm going to stop other things. I like PBS. I love Big Bird. I actually like you too. But I'm not going to keep on spending money on things to borrow money from China to pay for.
The reference there, by the way, was to the moderator, Jim Lehrer, who happened to be from PBS, hence why Romney said, I like you, but I'm going to cut your funding. So this has been an issue for Republicans going back decades. Again, a major complaint here is that NPR and PBS lean progressive. They just don't think this is something the government should be doing with its money, with taxpayer funds. The White House recently, this White House, the Trump White House, has pointed to an NPR article about queer animals, a PBS documentary about transgender teens. They also talked about the lack of coverage of Hunter Biden's laptop story on these networks. Now, a little background here in terms of how much these networks, PBS and NPR, depend on taxpayer funding. Congress appropriated about $535 million for those stations this year. Most of those funds typically distributed to 1,500 local stations nationwide, which produce shows themselves, but also pay NPR and PBS for the rights to air national shows. Just a bit of context here. For every American, if you average this out by taxpayer, we each pay about $1.50. To the Corporation for Public Broadcasting annually. That does compare to about $200 per British taxpayer for what they have to pay for the BBC, the national broadcaster there. Now, as a percentage here, federal funding accounts for a not insignificant number for these stations, but still the numbers we're seeing here, the average public radio station gets about 8% of its revenue from the appropriation of the government. For TV stations, it's about 17% of its revenue. So the vast majority of funding for NPR and PBS, as well as local stations, come from donations and grants, as they like to say over there, from people like you. So it does not appear that this will kill NPR and PBS, but certainly make things slightly more challenging for them. But we are hearing from people over there that this is already boosting donations and announcements, and the coverage around the fact that the government may cut here funding to NPR and PBS may significantly boost donations. They're hoping that that will, if they have to cross that bridge, help fill the gap there if the government cuts funding. All right, our next story comes to us from CBS News. He's back. Former President Biden, well, briefly last night, he gave a speech, his first public remarks since leaving office in January. He focused last night in a speech on preserving Social Security and urged that, quote, "We cannot go on like this as a divided nation." Biden went after the Trump administration, though he didn't mention Trump by name. He also didn't address his departure from last year's presidential race. This was very much focused on a critique of the current administration. Take a quick listen here.
Fewer than 100 days, this new administration has done so much damage and so much destruction. It's kind of breathtaking it could happen that soon.
All right, so that was a bit of Biden last night. He called Social Security a sacred promise. He touted his administration's efforts to cut Social Security fraud and then mocked claims by Elon Musk and Trump officials that they're preventing 200-year-olds and 300-year-olds from getting Social Security, saying there is no evidence of that. Biden also criticized Trump's planned tax cuts, but his focus really was Social Security. He criticized Elon Musk for calling Social Security a Ponzi scheme and went through some of the administration officials there. Not surprisingly, the Trump White House reacting by hitting Biden back. They called his speech incoherent, said he had a feeble mind, and reinforced the fact that Trump has said recently that he's, quote, not touching Social Security, despite what Elon Musk has said. The next story comes to us from the medical site Stat News. The FDA announcing last week that it'll begin to phase out animal testing requirements for antibody therapies and some other drugs. This is a major shift here towards AI-based models and other what they call human-relevant tools. The plan is to reduce and hopefully replace animal testing with other methods for developing certain medications in a bid to lower research costs and eventually the price of prescription drugs. The FDA is encouraging researchers to use modeling and AI to predict how a drug will perform, as well as what they call organs on a chip, which are miniaturized devices that mimic organs and tissues. FDA Commissioner Marty Makary said the shift could improve drug safety and reduce research costs, as well as addressing ethical concerns. This has been a huge issue for animal rights advocates. It does come amid a lot of efforts to reduce the reliance on animal testing for drugs, as well as the requirements at the FDA. In some cases, they require companies to test on animals before they deem it safe for humans. But there have been some recent studies that show that about 90% of prescription meds that were shown to be safe and effective in animals do not work as hoped in humans. So they are hoping that technology, AI especially, might help here. The big question is, as far as these recommendations are concerned, whether the biopharmaceutical industry will embrace this new effort. In a statement, the National Association for Biomedical Research said, quote, "There is currently no full replacement for animal models in biomedical research and drug development. Animal studies remain essential for understanding how complex biological systems function." Among other things here. So it does not appear there will be an immediate change, but the FDA trying to get the industry to move in that direction. And they are hoping that they're going to encourage companies now to submit non-animal research and incentivize them to do so. Staying with science here, this comes to us from Newsweek. Scientists for the first time have grown a human tooth in a lab, marking a significant step here for what they hope is regenerative dental treatments. This study was carried out in London by King's College and Imperial College. They used a specially developed material to mimic the conditions required for natural tooth development. So if you thought you only had one chance after your baby teeth, they're hoping that you'll have a chance again and again sometime in the future here. The project could eventually offer patients a biological alternative to artificial fillings and implants, using your own cells to grow replacement teeth that integrate naturally into your jaw. The vision here, folks, is that literally you're growing a new tooth even after your adult tooth goes away, or if you didn't have an adult tooth behind that baby tooth. The ability here to grow human teeth could significantly improve outcomes for patients who lose adult teeth because of injury, decay, disease. They apparently introduced this special type of material that enables cells to communicate between each other. And that means that one cell can effectively tell another to start becoming a tooth cell, which mimics the environment of growing teeth and allows scientists to recreate the process of tooth development in the lab. Now, having successfully created the environment needed to grow teeth in a lab, scientists hope to figure it out in the real world, in a patient's mouth. Now, this could take a number of years, going from a lab scenario to a human mouth scenario, but still a pretty incredible development out of London. All right, next, a bit of aviation news for all of you out of the New York Times. Beginning early next year, if you catch an American Airlines flight, you will no longer have to pay for Wi-Fi. This is a big deal. American Airlines really bringing up the rear here when it comes to major airlines and free Wi-Fi. They say they're now working with AT&T to provide high-speed Wi-Fi for regular customers on most flights. The airline saying beginning next January, members of its free Advantage loyalty program will have access to the wireless service. It'll be available on 90% of their fleet. As I mentioned, American is bringing up the rear here. They're last. JetBlue was actually first. They had free Wi-Fi back in 2013. Congrats, JetBlue. Delta in 2023 introduced free Wi-Fi on most of their flights if you have a SkyMiles account. And United recently announced that they're getting together with Elon Musk's Starlink to offer free internet as well. So now American Airlines, welcome to the club. All right, I have to say this next story, kind of a weird one out of Africa. The article from Reuters wire service. 2 Belgian teenagers were charged yesterday with wildlife piracy after they were found with thousands of ants packed in test tubes in what authorities back in Kenya said was part of a trafficking scheme. Now, in Kenya, they say that they're seeing more and more coming out of the airport, people trying to traffic smaller and lesser known species. The 2 19-year-olds were arrested earlier this month with 5,000 ants in a guest house. Yes, they were smuggling out 5,000 ants out of Nairobi. They apparently told a judge there that they were collecting the ants for fun, and they didn't know it was illegal to steal 5,000 ants from Kenya. There's actually another similar case going on in Kenya involving a Kenyan man and a Vietnamese guy who were also trying to traffic ants out of the country. The Kenyan Wildlife Service saying the men were all involved in trafficking ants to markets in Europe and Asia. Apparently, this is a species of red ant. Again, these guys say they were just doing this totally for fun. They had no idea it was illegal. Folks, when you travel anywhere, let the animals stay where they live. All right, finally here, a bit of movie meets politics news from the San Francisco Chronicle, because everything feels like politics these days. The producer of the Home Alone films from back in the 90s, Chris Columbus, is speaking out about Donald Trump's cameo in Home Alone 2. He says that the appearance by Trump in Home Alone 2, remember when he's in the lobby and Macaulay Culkin, Kevin McAllister is looking for directions, and Donald Trump at the time tells him which direction to go in? Well, Chris Columbus, the producer, says 30 years later, that cameo is a curse, and he would still love to cut the scene out, but believes Trump would actually deport him if he did. Columbus telling the newspaper that the moment in which Trump, who was then a real estate tycoon who owned the Plaza Hotel, that moment that he gives directions to Macaulay Culkin, he calls it an albatross and wishes it was gone, but he can't cut it because he jokes, if I cut it, I'll be considered sort of not fit to live in the US, so I'll have to go back to Italy or something, is what apparently he told the newspaper. And the backstory here is a bit interesting. Columbus says that Trump owned the Plaza Hotel at the time, and he, quote, bullied his way into the movie. Columbus and filmmakers saying we had to pay the fee to film at the hotel, but he also said, and this is Columbus claiming what Trump said, that the only way you can use the plaza is if I'm in the movie. So he agreed to put Trump in the movie at the time. Now, apparently, Columbus intended to cut the scene afterwards, but when they screened it, the audience applauded when they saw Trump back then during a screening. So he said, you know what, leave him in the movie. It's a moment for the audience. So that's Columbus's take. Well, Trump has been asked about this, and he claimed just a couple of years ago that he was begged to be in the movie, that he was very busy, didn't actually have time to do it, but they begged him to do it, so he appeared in the film. They were nice, but they were persistent, and I agreed, and the rest is history. Trump has implied that that scene is the reason why Home Alone 2 was a success. So a bit of the back and forth there about Home Alone 2 that you're probably not expecting on this podcast, which takes us to on this day in history. We begin today in 1943 with a experiment gone wrong / gone right. Back in 1943 on this day, a chemist named Albert Hoffman in Basel, Switzerland, was working in a laboratory and accidentally consumed LSD. At the time, he was working on a synthetic drug as part of scientific research for medical compounds, and somehow he ingested it. After taking the drug, he was disturbed by the unusual sensations and hallucinations and colors that he saw. So then he decided to, well, naturally, try it again to see what this was all about. So he intentionally took the drug LSD a second time after it was an accident the first time and confirmed, wow, this is a wild physical and mental state. He then published a report announcing his discovery that LSD, this compound he'd been working on for other matters, really was a fascinating hallucinogenic drug. And there you have it. On this day in history, LSD discovered by accident. A couple of years later, on this day in history in 1947, the term Cold War was coined for the first time to describe the U.S.-Soviet relationship. A businessman, Bernard Baruch, in a speech unveiling his portrait in the South Carolina House of Representatives, coins the term Cold War to describe the relations. The phrase struck. It was a mainstay in the language of American diplomacy. In history now, he's like, it's not a hot war, but a Cold War. And so there you have it. Bernard Baruch in South Carolina coining the term Cold War on this day. All right, fast forward here to 1963. Civil rights activist Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. He was responding to a group of local clergymen who had criticized him for leading street protests, and he defended his tactics and wrote the famous quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." All right, on this day in history, 22 years ago, on this day in 2003, a 40-year-old Michael Jordan would play his last game, his official last game in the NBA. This would be effectively his third retirement from the NBA, but on this day in history, 40-year-old Mike hangs it up. All right, a bit of music history before we go. On this day in 1964, 61 years ago today, Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones released their first album, titled, naturally, The Rolling Stones. They would go on to make music for about 60 years. And on this day in 2002, Nelly releasing Hot in Here. Nelly's still going strong after all these years. All right, I want to thank you for listening to the Mo News Podcast. Thank you for your support. A reminder, we have our annual sale going on right now. We depend on your support. We are majority supported by all of you at Mo News Premium. So if you support what we're doing at Mo News, want to support independent journalism, support what we're doing on all platforms, please consider joining Mo News Premium. You can do it over at mo.news/premium. We're offering 20% off right now with the code Good News. Again, you can try out the code Good News. We're trying to give you some good news at a time where there is some challenging news, as we all know. By joining Mo News Premium, you get access to our premium podcast, where you get all interviews first. You get exclusive episodes as well. You get our premium Instagram page. It's where we answer questions. We do workshops. We actually have a workshop tonight on all things immigration. So that is one of the many perks we have at Mo News Premium. Your chance to ask the experts questions along with all of us here at Mo News. All right, so you can check that out again over at mo.news/premium. Everybody, I will see you back here tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News Podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.